joining us for today's Ignite Webcast. My name is Josh Topal, and I'm a Program Manager for Office 365. Ignite events are a series of technical workshops for IT professionals and Microsoft partners, and the Ignite Webcast series will address different technical subjects and scenarios that are really beneficial to anyone who wants to increase their knowledge of the Office 365 suite. So today we're really happy to have, again, Daniel Kenyon-Smith to be our presenter as he dives into Office 365 cutover and staged migrations. So Daniel is an Office 365 architect. He's joining us from the UK, actually. And today's session provides a really great opportunity to hear directly from Microsoft employees and learn more about some of the new features and releases in Office 365. So today's webcast will be about an hour, and we're going to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end to field questions from anyone on the call. So I ask, please hold your questions till the end. Then during our Q&A portion of the call, you can go ahead and type them into the chat box. One last thing is that we are recording today's session, so it will be available online on the community blog post and the Ignite blog post, as well as the Office 365 YouTube channel. So I'm going to go ahead and paste those into the chat window right now. That's it for me for the introduction. So without further ado, Daniel, are you ready to go?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Okay, so we may as well just jump straight into the session here. So as Josh said, we're looking here specifically around simple migrations. So we've got the IMAP, cutover, and staged migrations. So as you may see through some of the slides, there are actually some abbreviations. So cutover exchange migration being CAM and staged exchange migration being SEM. So we've got a summary slide here of all the different migration tools and options that are available for, or natively available for, moving to Exchange Online. So we've obviously got, a varied choice here of whether you want to move to the cloud quickly, or whether, you want to move at a slower pace and maybe have more of the richer features available. So depending on the business requirements, either technical or business requirements, may depend or may determine which migration method you would actually use to move your mailboxes to Office 365. So we've got various options on here, and obviously one of those, and one of the areas that we'll dive into a little bit more in this session, is the IMAP migration. So obviously we can use that for IMAP-based source environments to move to Office 365, or we could also be migrating from other, say, cloud providers that also provide the IMAP service. We've then got the cutover exchange migration, as we said, CEM, and that's for organizations that are running Exchange on-premise. We essentially use a web-based tool to migrate the entire Exchange organization and all the Exchange mailboxes, so including appointments and meeting requests, contacts and tasks and things we would move straight over to Office 365. And then we have the staged Exchange migration. So it's what we class as sort of a simple coexistence. So it's not a big bang approach like the cutover migration that we just mentioned there. It's more of a staged migration, but doesn't give you the rich features that are available in the last option on there, which is the hybrid deployment. So we won't be covering hybrid deployment in this particular session, but we do have another webcast set up for about another 2 weeks, which will cover hybrid, and we will go into more detail in hybrid deployments. But for this particular session, we'll just cover the IMAP, staged, and cutover. But a quick background on the hybrid is essentially a rich coexistence. So that's designed for more gradual migration to Office 365. And either for a longer term coexistence or a permanent coexistence between Exchange on-prem and Office 365. The hybrid piece gives you more features and functionalities than some of the simpler migrations that we're going to talk about today. Essentially things like sharing of free busy, sharing of calendars, but you do require a hybrid server that sits in between and acts as a gateway that connects your on-premise organization to Office 365. So that hybrid server could be Exchange 2010. You would need a minimum of SP2 to run the hybrid configuration wizard, or Exchange 2013. One thing to note is if you are wanting to connect to our current Office 365 offering, which is based on Exchange 2010, which is what we call Wave 14, then you would need the newly released SP3 to connect to the current Wave 14, and the SP3 would be a definite requirement for connecting to Wave 15, which is the Exchange 2013 version of Office 365, which is not released at this time. But if you wanted to have a Wave 15 tenant, you would require SP3 on premise to allow you to do that. Or alternatively, you could obviously have Exchange 2013, and Exchange 2013 would allow you to connect to the Wave 15 Office 365. But one thing to note there is Exchange on-premise 2013 only supports up to Exchange 2007. So if you had any 2003 on-premise, you would either need to use Exchange 2010 SP3 to connect to Wave 15, or move from or migrate from your on-premise 2003 to Exchange 2013 on-premise. Okay. So there are some additional onboarding options here that we can quickly go through. Some that are user-driven, that are admin-driven, and again, you know, these may be options for sort of more of smaller organisations rather than a larger organisation where they may want to have some form of hybrid in there. But essentially, you could just provision new greenfield mailboxes. So, you know, essentially just creating a brand new mailbox with no data in there. And then obviously the user could either pull their information if it's in a PST, for example, and just copy that data across, or essentially you can create a new mailbox and have these connected accounts where you can have up to 5 connected accounts. Or you could create a new mailbox and then use some form of importing, or automated importing of PST files. So we do have a PST capture tool that will allow us to import PST files. So it will do a discovery, find all the PST files, and then you can import those either to an on-premise mailbox or directly into a mailbox in Office 365 if that mailbox has already been migrated. And you can also migrate data directly into the online archive if that's been enabled for that particular user. So we've got some key decision factors, and based on these key decision factors, it helps determine which method best suits the requirements for your business needs. So we've got, where are you migrating from? So what's the source server? Is it an Exchange server? Is it an IMAP? Is it Notes? Or is it Google? Or, you know, some other form of cloud-based service? And depending on, you know, the source server environment can then depend on what migration tool or method that you use for migrating to Office 365. Also the size of the organization as well, and the size of the mailboxes, are the large, medium or small, again may determine which tool you use. Some tools are limited to a maximum number, so you know that may rule out a particular migration method. And then of course we've got the coexistence requirements. So as we've said, some of the methods that we will look at today, we will cover the simple pieces, but from a rich coexistence perspective, as we said, there is a separate hybrid session which will cover, you know, the additional features that you get through running a hybrid server, such as there may be a business requirement to be able to share free busy between a mailbox that's in Office 365 and a mailbox that's on premise. That would force you down the rich coexistence route. Again, from a provisioning perspective as well, there are various different ways that we can provision new accounts in Office 365. So that could be using something like dsync, directory synchronization tool, which we did briefly cover in the last session that we had. And again, in about 3 weeks' time, we'll have a dedicated session on directory sync. But essentially that will allow us to synchronize objects from on-premise to Office 365. And we've got a couple of slides talking briefly about directory sync in this session as well. And we can obviously do manual provisioning, so we can import things like CSV files, and we can do automated provisioning as well. So again, depending on whether that's like a standard directory sync or whether we're using something like FIM, which is Forefront Identity Manager. And then another sort of factor which doesn't impact the migration as such, but is around identity. So whether you would be having an on-premises identity and mastering all of your identities on-premise, or whether you would actually be using cloud IDs and your mastering of those IDs would be in Office 365, and then obviously that would determine whether you would have something like Active Directory Federation Services on-prem and ADFS, which would provide that single sign-on for you. Okay, so that's essentially what we're talking there. All of these different factors will ultimately help you drive out what your deployment plan would be for moving to Office 365 and what the solution may look like. So we also said we'd look at Directory Sync's role in migration. So as we said, there is a Directory Sync tool which can be downloaded from the Office 365 portal, and that's just a 64-bit version of that tool. There are some more advanced features that we can do with Directory Sync. Again, we won't sort of cover that into this in this session, but essentially installing Directory Sync on or into your on-premises environment means that you would ultimately get a unified global address list, unified GAL. So any objects that you create on premise, Directory Sync would then connect into your tenant, or you would connect Directory Sync to your tenant, and then essentially give you that unified GAL. So new users, new contacts, new distribution groups will be created on premise and then synchronized to Office 365. And then obviously when you move that first user to Office 365, Directory Sync has been in place, and therefore that one user in Office 365 can now see the global address list for everybody on premise. And obviously if somebody wants to email a particular user in the cloud, it will reroute that mail back to on-premise and vice versa. And again, as we go through the slide deck, towards the back end of this slide deck, we do talk a little bit about the mail routing and how that works at I guess a sort of fairly high level, but it is something that we will cover. So again, simple coexistence where we have like a staged migration, for example. We would require Directory Sync in place for a staged migration. We may or may not have federation, so we may or may not be using cloud identities. Again, that can be down to a particular business driver, and it doesn't require for you to have on-premises Exchange hybrid servers. But if we want to do an automated provisioning, then we would have a dedicated server that's for Directory Sync. So we would need one server on premise, but again, it's only for sort of a fairly simple, lightweight server that allows us to be able to synchronize and give us that unified GAL between on-premise and cloud, and obviously is an enabler for mail routing. So you can have a unified SMTP namespace between on-premise and cloud. And again, we'll sort of cover that in a little bit more detail as we go through. So in the current version of Office 365, which, as we said, is Wave 14, which is based on Exchange 2010, is not how this looks. So this is the Office 365 preview, as you can see from the blue bar at the top. So this is Wave 15, and this is based on Exchange 2013 in Office 365. So some of you may have already created a preview tenant and maybe already gone in and had a little look around to see what's in that tenant, how it looks, and how it interfaces with on-premise. But essentially, all of the migrations that we're talking about here today will all be driven through the Exchange Admin Center and through the recipients, and then on the migration tab, and from there we would upload our files, and that's where we would then start the migrations. And essentially the Office 365 interface would then connect back into your on-premise organization and migrate the mailboxes that have been specified within a particular CSV file, for example. Okay. So that's just building that slide out there. So again, it's just running through the options. You can click on the little plus sign, start the migration, and then specify where you're migrating from. So we'll talk about what some of the requirements are in order to be able to run one of these migrations. So what the on-premise requirements are, and how you would determine whether you're going to do, an IMAP migration. So obviously select IMAP, you can select Cutover, or whether you're doing a staged. And there's also some things that go on in the background to determine whether it's a staged or a Cutover migration. So of course we can also use PowerShell as well as the GUI. So we can use some of the commandlets that are mentioned here. So we can create a new migration batch, for example, specify the relevant commands and the relevant location of a CSV file, and then obviously we can start the migration through PowerShell. So all we would need to do is connect from your local PowerShell, connect into remote PowerShell, or move into remote PowerShell functionality, which connects you to your Office 365 tenant, and then obviously you can start the migration and run the migration batches from there. So as we said, this is one of the options for migrating to Office 365, which is the IMAP migration, and as we said, it uses a web-based tool for migrating data from your on-premises IMAP servers. And essentially, as we saw briefly in the last slide, you just walk through that wizard and specify the relevant details and relevant credentials. So the first thing that will happen is we'll create things like empty mailboxes in the cloud for the users that you want to have a mailbox in Office 365. And as we said, that's done by uploading a CSV file. It can be done by using the remote PowerShell, or we can create those empty mailboxes using the GUI inside the Office 365 portal as well. So essentially we have to provision these accounts separately if we're doing an IMAP migration, and then we do the data migration again as a sort of separate step. It's not a one-step provision and move data at the same time. They're done in separate steps. So once we've provisioned or created those empty mailboxes, we would then enter the server credentials or server connection settings. So, for example, we would specify the FQDN of the IMAP server, which could be imap.company.com, and you can obviously test that you've got connections into that IMAP server by just using either an IMAP client, standard ping over the internet, or you can also use the test migration server availability, which was one of the commands that was just specified on the screen before. And then what we need to do is we need to ensure that the admin that's doing the migrations has got access to the mailboxes that you want to migrate. So you need to assign the relevant permissions, and you'd effectively assign full permissions to either each individual mailbox, or we can assign receive as permissions on the actual database itself. Then we specify which mailboxes we want to move inside the wizard, and then Exchange Online will use the credentials and the details that you've specified in that wizard to then connect to your IMAP server, and then obviously migrate the mail content. So we say specifically mail content there, because we can't migrate obviously with an IMAP migration things like calendars, contacts, tasks, and other sort of non mail items. So it's specifically just sort of the mailbox. One of the other things that Exchange Online will do is it won't create any more than 10 connections into the IMAP server, just to avoid overusing the resources on the source server and bandwidth. So let's have a look at some of the features then. So as we've said, it's a web-based tool. The admin will specify the IMAP server on-premise, and you run through the wizard, and Exchange Online essentially queries the on-premise server using the permissions that you've specified, and migrates the data from that location, from those source servers. So as I said, with an IMAP migration, we can essentially migrate from various IMAP sources or servers or messaging platforms. That could obviously be Exchange, so assuming that you've got IMAP enabled, it could be a 5.5 server, it could be Exchange 2000 or higher, or it could be another hosted solution or provider that again provides that IMAP feature and allows you to migrate the mail only into Office 365. Yeah, so just on the last point there, so there's no on-premise migration tool required. So again, it's all driven through the Office 365 portal, through the wizard, and then it just dives into the on-prem environment based on the credentials that you've specified. So of course we need the relevant ports open to allow us to connect in. Obviously either secure or unsecure are the ports that we've got on there. We've also mentioned that the users and mailboxes must be provisioned prior to migration. So we said we can do that through CSV files, manual, PowerShell, but essentially we still have to provision the accounts before we do the data migration. Register all of the SMTP domains in the Office 365 tenant to make sure that none of the domain names are stripped off as we go through the migration. We obviously specify the user credentials and prepare that CSV file. So the CSV file itself needs to be formatted in a particular format. So it just gives you an example on there of obviously the email address. You can specify username and you can specify what the password will be for a user that's now going to be moving to Office 365. But there are some limitations of the CSV file itself, so we can only have a maximum of 50,000 rows within inside that CSV file, and it can only be up to a maximum of 10 meg in size for us to be able to upload that into the Office 365 wizard. So as we said, we've got the migration, so what's migrated and what isn't, so essentially the scope of an IMAP migration. So we mentioned in there, it's just essentially your inbox and any sort of folders within inside there. So no calendars, contacts, and the like. Maximum of 500,000 items can be migrated with an IMAP migration from that source, but it is possible to exclude specific folders. So if you did want to just move, the inbox, for example, and you didn't want to move things like deleted items, then you can specify which folders that you want to exclude from that migration. And then things that are not migrated, as we've said, is just mail messages and inbox essentially. Obviously, any folders that you exclude, won't be migrated. The folder format as well, with a slash in, and any messages that are larger than 25 meg. So essentially, in Office 365, we have a transport limit of attaching a message of nothing larger than 25 meg. So that's where that limitation is applied. So that applies to any type of migration, and anybody that's in Office 365, if they want to send emails between each other or to somebody externally, then the maximum message attachment size is 25 meg. There are some tools to work out what's in what's in mailboxes on premise with regards to mailbox or message sizes or attachment sizes. So sometimes you can use things like pfdev, admin, or ex merge to be able to determine if you've got any messages larger than 25 meg, but that depends on what your own internal transport limit is. So if it's more than that, then you may need to again look and try and reduce or remove those messages before you do the migration. If it's less than 25 meg, then there's nothing to worry about. Those mailboxes will just migrate up with items that are lower than 25 meg. So as we've said, the migration flow here then is provisioning users, and then the mailboxes in Office 365. As we've said, we need to gather the IMAP credentials, prepare that CSV file. We then run the wizard from the Office 365 portal, upload the CSV file, specify all the server settings. We essentially do an initial sync, and then we do a delta sync every 24 hours after that. That's non-configurable, that's a static 24 hours. And then we can update any of the AMX records, to mark the migration as complete, and then we'll essentially just migrate all the remaining data that's arrived in on-premise. You then do the final sync and cleanup, and everything's completed and flipped over to Office 365. So all of your mail, obviously, then once you move the MX record, all mail gets delivered directly into Office 365 as opposed to your on-prem IMAP server. So the next one is the Cutover Exchange migration. So this is a fairly sort of quick, low-impact option for moving from an Exchange environment, the 2003, 2007, or 2010, and obviously moving to Office 365. And again, this is designed really for customers that don't have any complex requirements around coexistence, so none of that federation, free busy, or offboarding requirement. So an offboarding meaning moving somebody from Office 365 back to on-premise. And essentially for customers that want to move quickly and easily without having to have a great deal of change to their current environment, and not having to install server software and do a whole world of change control and configuration. It's also viable for customers that have got small business server, something like either 2003 or 2008, for example. But what this migration does do is as we call it, an all at once or the big bang approach of moving to the cloud. So it's kind of an all or nothing approach here. So there's no sort of coexistence or of any form. So again, what we'll do here then is migrate the mailbox data from on-prem to Office 365. Again, the administrator would initiate the move through the web-based portal in exactly the same location. Obviously this time we would specify that we want to do the cutover exchange migration. And with this particular migration, there's no need to do the provisioning and data as separate steps like we did in the IMAP migration. We can just migrate the content, and the provisioning will be done for us as part of that migration. So again, we specify the admin credentials with the permissions over the mailboxes on premise. We need to enable the Outlook Anywhere or RPC over HTTPS, because that's the method that we use to connect into the on-premise Exchange organization. And then the Exchange Online will start that migration process and use again the credentials that we've specified to start migrating those mailboxes from on-premise to Office 365. So again, let's have a look at the features and benefits that we have for the cutover exchange migration. So as we've said, we have support for moving content from Exchange 2003 and later. Web-based tool. We've got no requirement to install any software on premise. It's used as a merge operation, not a move. And we do perform high fidelity migrations, so it's not just the mail data, we also move things like the calendar and tasks and all of those things as well, not just the mail content. As we've said, it's got its own built-in provisioning, so that's different to the IMAP. We need to enable Outlook Anywhere to enable allow for us to connect into the source environment. We need to have some public certificates in there as well, because Exchange Online will verify the name that it's connecting and allow us to be able to connect, assuming that we've got a valid certificate. From a permissions perspective, again, we can do receive as, which is generally preferred and the easier option, but that needs to be done at the database level, or we can give full control to each of the individual mailboxes. Again, we can set up all the accepted domains, i.e. the domain names, SMTP domain names, registered, added, registered and verified in Office 365. And it also allows us to maintain replyability, so it copies across the legacy DN to allow us to be able to reply to emails that was originally sent to a user on premise, and now obviously that mailbox is in Office 365. So this type of migration is typically suited for sort of small to medium based organisations, where again we don't need to install any on-premise environment. You're already running Exchange and you want to sort of quickly and easily move over to Office 365 in this sort of big bang approach. And again, there's an option around whether you want to use cloud identities, or whether you may want to use your existing identity, whether that's Active Directory, for example, on premise, and use something like ADFS. Those can be added in later. So the limitation with this, and as we talked about in one of the first slides around being able to determine the decision factors, is you can only migrate up to 1,000 mailboxes for the Cutover Exchange migration. So if you've got more than that, then you may need to look at a different migration method, such as the staged migration, which again we'll come to shortly. We mentioned that you need to have Outlook Anywhere enabled and the public CA certificate authority in order for us to be able to migrate those mailboxes. Again, with the permissions, full access or receive as to the database, and directory sync needs to be disabled in Office 365. So essentially what that means is, if directory sync is disabled, then it would use the cutover migration, and if directory sync is enabled in Office 365, that determines that you want to do a staged migration. So that's how Office 365 can determine which type of migration you're looking for. So you can enable and disable actually the directory sync through the Office 365 portal. And then obviously if you were doing the next migration, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is a staged migration, then you would have a directory sync tool installed and enabled in Office 365. But for the cutover migration, that would need to be disabled to allow us to be able to do that cutover migration for those mailboxes. And as we've said, we register all of our SMTP domain names in the Office 365 portal. And if we've got multiple primary SMTP domains, then we would just register multiple domains, verify that we own them, and then we can start to use those SMTP domain names in Office 365. So from the accounts and passwords, as we've said, the migration tool will do the provisioning for us, so it's not a separate process. The migration will enable the replyability to your email messages. So as we've said, it copies over that legacy DN attribute. From a passwords perspective, there'll be no access to your passwords from the source directory, so new passwords will need to be created for all of the users. And the admin will get a link to download the passwords, and you can specify that users must change password at next login. So users will get distributed those passwords, however that may be, whether that's through text message or through some other form, and then obviously the first time the user logs in, then they'll be prompted to change that password. So the scope of the cutover migration, so we've got a sort of a fairly extensive list of what's migrated, i.e. what's in scope, and what's not migrated, what's out of scope. So I'll just run through through the list essentially. So what would be migrated as part of the scope would be, what's on the slide already, but also things like the read status of an email message, any of the flags, your special folders, so the deleted items, sent items, draft, search folders. From an email message item perspective, all delivery reports, any NDRs, any read or non-receipt items, any of the rules, any categories you've got in there, calendar items, all of your reoccurrences, any meeting sort of request cancellations or responses, all of your out of office settings, got things like tasks, notes, contacts, delegates, folder permissions, and any of your Outlook settings, so things like your folder favorites, would all be migrated as part of the cutover migration. For the out of scope, As it lists on there, again, we've got some security groups, some dynamic distribution lists, things like system mailboxes, your dumpster, send as permissions, any messages that are larger than 25 meg. It wouldn't retain your mailbox GUID, so essentially what's happening is when we do the migration, you're creating a brand new mailbox. We're not moving any of your attributes from on-premise to Office 365. So by having a new mailbox GUID, that's essentially means that the user would need to create the new profile and would need to download and sync their email to an OST file. Now, obviously, some of the other migrations, such as a hybrid migration, would migrate that mailbox GUID up to Office 365, and therefore wouldn't require you to resynchronize your OST file from a hybrid migration perspective. But from a cutover exchange migration, it does create a new mailbox, and therefore any mail that's in that mailbox that's been migrated would need to be synchronized locally into the OST file, assuming that you've got your mailboxes configured for cached mode. Okay. So partial migrations are not possible, so we can't do any folder exclusions. We can't do any unified messaging mailboxes, then can't be migrated. And as we've said, the existing cached mode files and OST files are not preserved, so and that's what's matched to that mailbox GUID. So as I say, you would need to create a brand new profile for that for those users. So the user experience, so the admin would need to distribute the password. As we've said, users would need to create the new profile using the Office 365 username. So it could be the UPN, so the user principal name for accessing Office 365. And then you would need to create the auto discover record. So you can go into the Office 365 portal, and under domains you will see the
Yeah, Daniel, are you there? I
Yep.
think we lost audio. Oh, now you're back.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay. Well, we just lost for a second there, did we?
Just a second, yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So essentially, we need to create an auto discover record that points to Outlook.com, so you can get that detail from the Office 365 portal under domains. And essentially, when a user types in their email address, user@company.com, the auto discover record would then redirect them to Office 365, and then essentially build the profile from there. Yeah. So one thing to note, obviously, is if you're downloading, or let's say 500-600 users have been migrated, and those 500 or 600 users are now going to be downloading their OST files, then you just need to be wary of network bandwidth while users are recreating their OST files. So you just need to make sure that you've got the relevant bandwidth to be able to do that as an initial sync, of course, and then users will only effectively download the delta that's been added to their mailbox. Okay, so the cutover exchange migration flow. So as we said, Exchange Online will require Outlook Anywhere or RPC over HTTPS to be able to dive into the on-premise environment and create those mailboxes in Exchange Online. You just need to specify the FQDN of the Exchange server as you go through the wizard, so whether that's exchange.company.com. And then also the RPC endpoint for that as well. So that could be something like mail.company.com. And we can also obviously use some of the Exchange remote connectivity analyzer tests as well, as it mentions on there. And then Exchange Online will synchronize the mailbox content to the Office 365 mailboxes, but users can still remain connected to their original mailboxes while data is being migrated to Exchange Online. And then after the initial migration is complete, any of the changes are then again synchronized every 24 hours until the admin, or the migration administrator, finalizes that particular migration. So as we can see on there, we've got these delta syncs or incremental syncs. So as we said, that's just synchronizing data from on-premises to Office 365 every 24 hours, so that any new mail that gets sent to the Exchange on-prem mailbox is copied up to the sort of corresponding Office 365 mailbox as well. So we do the initial sync, then we change the MX record. As we say, we can mark that migration batch is complete. It'll do the final sync and cleanup, and then we can assign the licenses to the users. So we can either do that manually through the portal, or we can script that through remote PowerShell. Okay. So actually, just before we move on to staged migration, so just to confirm that the Cutover Exchange migration has a limit of 1,000 users, and as we said, that synchronization that happens in the background, that 24-hour sync is not configurable. So from a staged Exchange migration, this is essentially where users can be migrated to the cloud, again using the web-based tool. The same conditions and limitations would apply as what we've talked about before for regular Exchange migrations. But this time, instead of doing this big bang approach, we can actually migrate users in stages, hence the reason why it's called stage migrations. And this is essentially done in two ways. We mentioned earlier, by enabling directory sync in the Office 365 portal. So it looks at the attribute and essentially says, is directory sync running? Depending on whether that equals yes or no, then depends on whether you're going to be doing a stage migration or a cutover migration. And then what we do is we load this CSV file into the wizard, but we only list the partial users that we want to migrate. So we're not specifying everybody, we're just specifying a subset of people that we actually want to move to Office 365. So it could be a particular batch of people, specify them in the CSV, follow the wizard through, and then essentially only those people will be moved from on-premise. So we generally call this a simple coexistence. The reason why it's a simple coexistence is because we do have that unified GAL. So essentially we have the directory sync tool installed in your current environment and synchronizing up to Office 365. The directory sync tool will synchronize every 3 hours. So any changes that you make on premise will, depending on when that 3-hour window is, will make its way up to Office 365 and update the objects in the cloud. So all of the remediation tasks that you would normally do with an on-premise migration when you're installing direct sync, so if you're doing a hybrid or even the stage migration, all of the AD remediation work should be completed as well before you start to move mailboxes to Office 365. So we've got the Office 365 Deployment Readiness Analyzer tool, and that allows us to run that in our environments on premise for Active Directory, and will give us an output of which objects and attributes need to be updated and remediated, such as it may have some strange characters that are not supported. Remediate those, and then we can ensure that all those objects are cleanly synchronized up to Office 365. Also, with the staged migration, we can share the same SMTP domain name. So that's where we would have obviously a user in the cloud and a user on-prem, and both of them can have their primary SMTP address of user@company.com, for example. Obviously, the limitation of the staged migration is We can't use the rich features that we could with hybrid, around the calendar and free busy, the federation and those features, which we'll cover in a further session in a couple of weeks. So some of the features and benefits. So again, we have sort of regular mail flow between mailboxes on-prem and cloud, and we'll shortly have a look at some of that mail flow in a few slides. We class it as a simple topology, and that's defined by the presence of having directory sync on-premise. As we said, mailboxes can be spread between on-premises and cloud, with the ultimate goal of having everybody in the cloud, so not having a long coexistence. If you wanted to have a long coexistence or a permanent coexistence, then that's where you would look to be implementing something like hybrid. Again, we've said the presence of the directory sync tool would determine whether it's a cutover or whether it's a staged. We need Outlook Anywhere enabled, permissions to the mailbox. What else have we got on here? Again, suited for large to medium organizations. So again, depending on the requirements, you can migrate batches of people, but essentially if you're a large organization, you may want to look down something like hybrid and have some of those richer features. So with the staged Exchange migration, as we said, it's not a big bang approach. We can only have up to 1,000 mailboxes in the CSV file, so we would have to do those in multiple batches. That's not the limit, it's just 1,000 per batch, as it were. It's not the total limit. And what will happen is when you migrate your users from on-premise to Office 365, the on-premise object will get stamped with a target address on the source mailbox, and that's what will allow mail flow coming into your organization. User 1 has been migrated to Office 365 and therefore has a target address, and that would route the mail up into Office 365. So we've got some slides on that coming up pretty much in the next slide or two. So some of the requirements and limitations. So with a staged migration, we only support Exchange 2003 and Exchange 2007. So we don't support Exchange 2010 or 2013 when doing the staged migration. And that's essentially because there was a security enhancement in Exchange 2010 and 13 that makes the NPSI, which is a name service provider interface protocol, which is read-only. And that's why we can't use staged migrations with 2010 and 2013. That NSPI feature was not added into 2007 or below, so we can still use the staged migration with those versions, but not with 2010 or 2013. So from a accounts provisioning, so we obviously use the directory sync tool. The directory sync tool will provision the accounts in Office 365, and it will provision those as mail-enabled users. When we do the migration, it will then convert that mail-enabled user in Office 365 into a mailbox-enabled user in Office 365. And we've got a slide right at the end that tells us that we actually need to then convert the on-premise object to a mail-enabled user. So we'll come to that in a minute, but essentially we will only convert the cloud mail-enabled user to a mailbox and then just stamp the target address on premise. We don't actually do any of the conversion of those objects whilst we're using a staged migration. If we're using a hybrid migration, hybrid will flip those objects on premise from a mailbox user to a mail-enabled user. And from a password perspective, again, you need to specify the passwords, and an administrator can force those password changes at next login. So the scope again, so what migrated, email messages, folders, rules, categories, out of Office settings, pretty much the list that we mentioned before, and what's not migrated, again, same sort of list as what we looked at for the Cutover Exchange migration. So partial migrations, again, not possible. Same again with the unified messaging, and same again with the OST files. So OST files, again, you would need to recreate again your Outlook profiles and connect those to Office 365, and then download the email data down into your OST file. So the format, again, we upload a CSV file and specify the email address, password, and we can force change password at next login. If you are using the password attribute, then we can specify the password, and the password would need to apply to the rules for Office 365 password policies. But that password attribute that you can specify is optional. So if you want to use single sign-on, so essentially you want to use your Active Directory on-premise AD accounts to connect to your mailbox in Office 365, then you can leave that password attribute blank. And again, you can, just leave that blank. So the user experience, so again, administrator can distribute the passwords, however that may be. Text message, for example. Users, again, create their Outlook profile. So again, we can use Auto Discover. Again, we can go into the portal and find out the domain name, and we can create the relevant Auto Discover record in DNS, which will then reroute the Outlook client over to Outlook.com, essentially. We've mentioned the recreation of the OST files. So again, using the staged migration, we don't carry across that mailbox GUID, hence the reason why we need to create the new mailbox profile. So we mentioned that we would talk about some of the mail routing. So again, this is specifically talking about the staged migration. So, I mean, this is fairly simple. This is pre-coexistence, so, this is exactly how it is today. Your MX record points to your on-premise organization. Somebody sends you an email. That email gets delivered into your Exchange organization, looks up the object, determines where that user is located, and then, essentially delivers that to their mailbox based on their particular email address. So obviously in this example, johndoe@contoso.com. So in that example there, nothing new. So this is when we start to bring Office 365 into the mix. So we'll just build this out a little bit. So this is when you're emailing on premises to Office 365. So again, your MX record is now still currently pointing to your on-premise Exchange organization. But you now have some users in the cloud and some users in on-prem. So we're doing this could either be a hybrid or it could be the staged migration. So we can see the different attributes and object types depending on where you're located. So in this instance, an email comes in externally from the internet, and it's the recipient is for John Doe. So again, the email would route in as it would today, hit your Exchange on-premise organization, look for the object on-premise, determine that it's delivered it to the right user by looking at its primary SMTP address. It would then hit that object, and then it would determine that there's been a target address that's been stamped onto that object as part of the staged migration, and that target address is an internal routing domain of, well, in this instance, john.doe at, and then it would be tenant name.mail.onmicrosoft.com. So we've got contoso.mail.onmicrosoft.com. And then it would essentially reroute that mail through MX records that are created to point for contoso.mail.onmicrosoft.com, which again points to Office 365, which would then determine your tenant and then would determine where your mailbox is located. And again, look you up and find that you are, John contoso.mail.onmicrosoft.com, and essentially deliver the mail to that user in Office 365. So mail in this instance is still pointing to on-prem and then reroutes back up to Office 365 until there's a point where you decide to change that MX record, of course, and then that would deliver directly into Office 365. So the next example is we've got an on-premise user to Office 365 being emailed by another on-premise user. So this is Jane Doe, and Jane Doe is has a mailbox on-premise, and she wants to email John Doe. So it essentially does the same thing. So it looks up the user, the attribute, find the right person, realize that there's a target address that's been stamped on that user, and then deliver that mail to the target address, which is the internal routing domain, which then delivers that to the mailbox up in Office 365. So of course Jane can see the unified gal on premise, and we'll look at the other scenario in a minute, but also John, who is now up in Office 365, has the unified gal as well, because we've been running directory sync. So as we said, that gives us the unified gal and the relevant attributes depending on where you're located. So just build that through, and that mailbox, that mail delivers to that mailbox. Okay, so this is the reverse. So Office 365 to on-prem. So we've got John who wants to email now Jane. Because we've had directory sync on premise, we've got that unified gal. In Office 365, Jane is showing as a mail-enabled user. So with all the relevant attributes that have been synchronized from on-premise, she's a mailbox-enabled user on-premise. So all John would do is open up his email, go into his gal, find Jane, and essentially send her an email. And then obviously in the background, that would look up the user in Exchange Online, find Jane Doe, which would actually be janedoe@contoso.com. Looks for the SMTP address jane.doe@contoso.com, realizes that there's a target address, so the mailbox is not there, and then sends that across to the MX record that owns jane.doe@contoso.com, which then delivers it to your Exchange on-premise organization, which again looks that user up and delivers that mail to the user on-premise. So there's a slightly different scenario for hybrid. Again, we're not going to talk too much about hybrid on this session, but essentially this is how mail routing would work for the staged migration piece, and it's that directory sync piece that gives us that enabler to determine where that mailbox is located and how we route that mail. So with the staged migration, there are no incremental syncs. It's a one-time initial sync after the items have been migrated. You can start using your cloud mailboxes, straight away. As we said, as part of that migration, the target address would be stamped on the source address to allow that mail routing. So similar sort of process. And pretty much the last slide, I think is the last slide actually, is what I mentioned earlier. So although we stamp the on-premise object with the target address, we don't actually convert the on-premise object to a mail-enabled user when we're using a staged migration. We do when we're doing a hybrid, but we don't when we're doing the staged migration. So in order to allow things like auto discover to redirect correctly, so auto discover would, if it's still pointing to on-premise, for example, we'll try and resolve it to the mailbox that you've got on-premise that has a target address. So it would still try and resolve it to the on-premise account, by converting that to a mail-enabled user, it would then redirect using the target address up to Office 365 and makes things a little bit cleaner from that perspective. And also we've got some scripts that are available to do this for you. So if you literally just do a search for, convert Exchange mailboxes to mail-enabled users using a staged migration, pretty much the text that we've got in there, just do a search, you would find the relevant VB scripts on the community site that will do this for you. So it would convert the object, and then it would allow you to be able to manage all of your cloud users on-premise if you wanted to, using Active Directory. Will also match up the newly converted mail-enabled users to the mailboxes that are now in Office 365. So if you want to change any attributes on a particular object, they'd be so yeah. Just make sure you do that as a final step. So just. So I think that's pretty much it. Josh, there's just some additional resources there for people to just have a look at, just from help files and some tools.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. And I guess we'll leave 5 minutes for anyone on the call who has a question. You can go ahead and type it into the bottom left, and then I'm going to post a couple of survey questions also. And remember, you can find this video recording on the original blog and the deck on the original blog post as well. But yeah, thanks a lot, Daniel, and we'll leave just 5 minutes for these questions.
Okay, so let's have a look at some of these questions. So in cloud only, Office 365 federated with local AD identity. If I need to migrate outside on-prem Exchange 2010 with 1,000 plus users, is hybrid deployment the only option? Will that require domain trust between the two AD environments? So I'm not sure I get that question. So that, I guess, it sounds like when you talk about two AD environments there, you're talking about multiple forests, or is it a sort of a resource forest scenario? You could use, if you've got more than 1,000 users with Exchange 2010, then yeah, that's pretty much the only option, because as we said, Exchange 2010 we couldn't do with a staged Exchange migration, and obviously if you've got 1,000 plus users, then we couldn't use the Cutover migration. So the hybrid deployment looks like the only option there, but I'm not sure what you mean around the domain trust. So if you've got, if that doesn't answer your question, just post another question in there, and I'll try and answer that. What have you found works best with room and resource mailboxes migrated over? They are provisioned as user mailboxes which require a license. What is the best way to make a room or shared mailbox without losing the content or consuming a license? Yeah, good question. I'm just thinking around whether it could be a shared mailbox. Obviously the data in there would need to be less than 5 gig, because shared mailboxes don't consume licenses. So you could potentially convert that mailbox to the type shared, which would then make that shared mailbox as opposed to a user mailbox. Hopefully that answers that question. Oops, some of these questions are just flipping about. So let me. Where can we find resources on migrating public folders? So there are some. There is a white paper out there, I believe. Well, there is for some options around how you can migrate from public folders. So in a current version, so as we stand today, without talking about the next release of Exchange and Office 365. It'd be a case of converting your public folders into, depending on what those public folders are used for, of course, could be a shared mailbox, could be a shared calendar, migrating that content across, assigning the permissions, and then just migrating those as, let's say, ordinary users, but shared mailboxes. So again, not consuming licenses, assuming that they're under 5 gig in size. And that, depending on the number of public folders, then obviously that's could potentially be a reasonable amount of work. For Exchange 2013, we've now got the new version of public folders, and there are some scripts, and again you should find those on TechNet if you just have a look at the Exchange 2013 public folder, the new version of public folders. There's some scripts that you can run on there that essentially will convert and migrate your public folders into these new form of public folders. So the new form because they use a different mechanism at the back end, but essentially, they still have hierarchy and the sort of folder structures, but behind the scenes it's a completely different mechanism. So there are some options or more options around migrating from public folders. Yeah, definitely. Are there any native directory sync tools for notes? I don't. Well, no, there isn't actually. So so from a directory sync perspective, the options that we have are the standard directory sync tool, and then we have the FIM, which is Forefront Identity Manager. So the Forefront Identity Manager does give us additional options, but it would need to be an LDAP based directory in order for us to be able to use the Forefront Identity Manager. That's currently not released as of yet, and we did talk about that a little bit last week actually in one of the sessions. So if you've got multiple forests and you want to migrate to Office 365, we can use the FIM, which will allow us to sync from those two forests to Office 365. And if you've got a non-active directory forest, whether that be Shibboleth or some form of LDAP, then you could also use FIM, but it would have to be an LDAP-based directory. I'm about to migrate a group-wise organization to Office 365. We will use DirSync from the local AD to the cloud. Do I need an on-premise Exchange 2013 server? Do I need to extend the schema to support Exchange 2013? So you don't have to have Exchange 2013. If you want to, by the sounds of it, if you're implementing an on-premise server, then you're probably looking at doing some form of hybrid. I would assume, although you are moving from group-wise. If you're moving directly from group-wise, then there are some tools that you can migrate from group-wise, I believe, directly to Office 365, so you wouldn't necessarily need the Exchange server in there. I'm not sure why you're putting the Exchange server in there, whether that's because you would do a double hop moving from group-wise to on-prem and then on-prem to Office 365. But essentially you should be able to just migrate them straight to Office 365. There are some partner tools out there that do that, I believe. But if you did put on-prem Exchange in there, then that could either be Exchange 2010 or with SP3, or it could be an Exchange 2013 server. And either way, you would have to update the schema. If you put SP3 in for 2010, you'd need to update the schema, and you would for Exchange 2013. Okay, so in Cutover migrations without directory sync, accounts are created and provisioned based on what the Cutover tool detects on the source mail server. Has found it's best if you don't create the users prior to the Cutover processes run. Is this the case, or is there a better way to approach creating user accounts? So I'm assuming the Cutover migration. So essentially we're talking about provisioning those then. based on like a CSV file is what we're saying, or through remote PowerShell. So that's what we're suggesting that the best way to provision those accounts are, and then migrate the data. But I guess you're saying, yeah, I mean, as part of the migration process with the cutover migration, it would provision those accounts at the same time. So I don't believe there's a better way of doing that other than trying to provision those up front. Can you forward me the link to the white paper? I'm assuming that's referring to the public folder question. Yes.
All right, and then again, if you have any more questions, you can always message me and I'll sync up with Daniel. But I think that's it. We're a little bit over, but yeah, thanks again for joining, and Daniel, thanks so much for the presentation.